We are talking today about Wilder Carbon Standard for Nature and Climate version 2. So version 1 was published in November 2021, and we have in the last month published version 2 of that. So we're really going to be focusing on the changes and the updates and anything of context of the reasons why we've done that. So we won't go into detail about what Wilder Carbon is or what the standard is hoping to achieve, or the business model that's attached to that. It is going to be specifically about those updates and changes. However, we have got previous webinars recorded which introduce the Wilder Carbon standard and mechanism, so we can share that with you afterwards if of interest, or of course very happy to have a follow-up call as well to talk with you directly. So without further ado, I will kick off with the slides. I'm joined by colleagues, Evan Bowen-Jones, who is the Acting Managing Director for Wilder Carbon, as well as the Chief Executive for Kent Wildlife Trust. We also have Ross Johnson, who is MBS Manager at Kent Wildlife Trust and is Lead Project Developer for Wilder Carbon. I'm hoping we also have Lawrence Ball with us. I can't see everybody, but Lawrence is recently involved in reviewing our data and MRV approach, also works at Kent Wildlife Trust. We're drawing very much on the skills of the charity and across the network, and is going to be supporting the continuous review of our data and MRV approaches. And we also have Tash on the call. You can't see her or her name, but Tash has been supporting with the marketing and development of Wilder Carbon. So what we'll cover today is a quick recap of the development of the standard and the governance and how we've now positioned that to deploy the Wilder Carbon solution at scale. We'll be giving you an update on the specific changes and updates within the standard, namely additionality, stacking and bundling. We're not going to answer all the questions, but we're going to focus on how we're approaching it at this moment in time, given the current context. Data and MRV, partner eligibility and project eligibility, and our core principles and ethos and what comes next for Wilder Carbon. As I said, please open Q&A throughout, keep asking us questions. We'll try and answer them throughout, but we'll make sure that there's time at the end to cover those as well. We'll give high-level updates and key developments, again, within a market context. Also, as I mentioned, we can follow up with conversations, and we will share the slides and a recording of the webinar with all registrants afterwards. So a quick recap on the development of the standard. We've changed the name. It was the Wilder Carbon Standards, but it is actually now the Wilder Carbon Standard for Nature and Climate. We really wanted to try and emphasize what it was trying to achieve in the name. The process that we've gone through over the last few years, as you can see, the Wilder Carbon Limited Company was incorporated in March 2021, acting very much now as the Secretariat for the standard. April 2021 was when we had successfully formed the Wilder Carbon Technical Standard Board. We had been bringing people in individually and working with them to form the core principles of the standard, but we have formed the board and the governance around that in April 2021. July 2021, first draft, development, consultation and revision constantly in a cycle. September 2021, we had the first draft formally reviewed and approved for publication in November 2021. We started a revision straight away. It needed updates and continued improvement. We started that formally in July 2022, going through a similar process to have that final version 2 launched in April this year. Some other dates of note was that we originally started planning and putting the principles together for this in March 2020. August 2022, we had our first projects validated that followed the Wilder Carbon Standard for Nature and Climate. And May 2023, last month, we sold our first units to our first approved buyers. And just a note of thanks to the guardians of the standard, for Nature and Climate, which are the Technical Standards Board. They've been a tremendous support, voluntary, and just really supportive, and giving their time for free to make this all happen. So we're very appreciative of their efforts. We are now live, so we're no longer in pilot, we're operational, we've got to the point of sale, and we now want to deploy the standard at scale. So we have tweaked the governance structure for the standard. As mentioned, we have our core technical standards board, but in order to scale up the improvements and keep up with the context that we're operating in, we're inviting experts to join advisory boards that can report to the technical standards board and recommend updates and changes, focusing on data and MRV, corporate claims, and the design of the products, the units, and farm focused. As you know, it's a very complex field. So I will share the slides afterwards with the detail of the governance structure. But if that sounds of interest to you, do get in touch, because we will be accepting expressions of interest for that very soon. I will now hand over to Evan, who's going to start to go into some of the detail around the changes to the version 2 of the standard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. So one of the key things that we wanted to do is set out a mechanism for enabling stacking, but I'll cover off bundling first. Wilder carbons are explicitly not bundled. They are they're not implicitly bundled either. There's a debate at the moment going on between what those two things mean. We regard biodiversity as a necessary component of the creation of resilient carbon units. So our requirement in the standard of 50% biodiversity uplift is to actually ensure that we get the best quality conservation grade carbon units possible. So we are selling carbon units, not bundled units. We do quantify those benefits, those biodiversity benefits as mentioned. That's part of our reputational defense and ensuring that we do get that future climate resilience and stability and an adaptation through the biodiverse systems that we're actually funding the restoration of. We do think that in the near future, we may be able to create a separate bundled unit to sell into an emerging market. We think that developers, for instance, are becoming quite interested in buying both biodiversity and carbon as a bundled unit. That market does not really exist yet, but it is definitely an area that we will explore going forwards. More immediately, stacking. So stacking is a really live conversation. As many of you will know, we're actually engaged with the DEFRA family as we speak on this. It's coming through the BSI process, which is being run by DEFRA. Ahead of that, the Standards Board have met and discussed how we can permit as much stacking as possible. We firmly believe that to enable supply, we don't want to close down future avenues of income for landowners who will otherwise, we are being told from all of the various nature-based solutions angles that we're working on at the moment, that landowners will not enter into this market if they think they're going to be closed out of future income streams. So the approach that we are taking is what we absolutely do not want to allow is double counting. What we cannot permit is the multiple counting of a mitigation unit against multiple impacts. So it has to be quantified impact matched to quantified mitigatory action, then represented on the registry, which we have established as high integrity registry, first one in the UK and possibly Europe, which we're now running alongside the system. That will then enable us to say, off the same site, we can generate different outcomes and sell those into different markets. And so a project developer or a landowner basically needs to state from the beginning that they are interested in that, to keep that door open from an additionality perspective. And then we have various ways that that can be worked through spatially. So I think one of the big misunderstandings potentially around stacking is the idea that in a given land holding, you can't have multiple ecosystem services being delivered at the same time and sold at the same time. You should be able to redline boundaries around, say, a BNG project within a land holding would be one way of that spatial separation. Some of the guidelines which are coming out at the moment very much are erring towards temporal separation, so additional benefit being generated on top of what's already been paid for, say from BNG, then being paid through carbon potentially. But we want to leave this as flexible as possible. So as far as we are concerned, if there is a business case which shows that multiple income streams are required, and this is coming onto the additionality piece, which is on the next slide. And if at the beginning it can be shown that there is a strong argument for multiple payments required for a given project to work, then the Technical Standards Board and the advisory boards will be proceeding on the basis that we can legitimately stack unless there is a legal reason that we can't. Additionality wise, as I say, we of course bear in mind the legal obligations that there may be on a site, but the one that we see as key within the standard is whether there is a legal obligation to restore a habitat to a carbon stable or carbon sequestering condition. There may be other legal obligations on that land, but providing they do not, providing this is not stipulated, and providing that the project developer or the landowner can demonstrate that the project is only feasible with carbon finance, then we, under the standard, take the view that it is a legitimate project as far as additionality goes. The finance is based on a 50-year minimum modelling exercise, which can include any grant income, which is being brought into the equation as well, and it's judged through justification statement, which we can also bring in issues like barriers, timing, financial sustainability, etc. So we take a nuanced approach to additionality. We don't, for example, set a minimum percentage of finance that is required from carbon to make a project feasible, recognizing again that going forwards, we are in a highly volatile scenario and things will change over time. And again, we don't want landowners to feel like they can't participate because they may be cut out of future revenue streams. Lawrence, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Evan. So the latest Wilder Carbon Data and MRV Approach version 2 provides an updated overview of the Wilder Carbon baseline and post-intervention modelling for biodiversity and carbon, as well as the reporting, monitoring, reporting and verification for carbon. So more specifically, it details how the carbon benefit, so sequestration or emissions reductions, are estimated for a given Wilder Carbon project through baseline and post-intervention carbon modelling. Broadly, this is achieved by continually integrating best available carbon data with our Carbon Plus Habitat tool, which is the web-based tool and user interface for calculating conservative carbon benefit valuations. Biodiversity baselines and anticipated post-intervention biodiversity values are estimated from the pre-project habitat and condition assessment, which uses the UK HAB methodology and the DEFRA biodiversity net gain metric. The expected percentage uplift is then checked to ensure it exceeds 50% as required by the standard. Carbon monitoring, reporting and verification, so the MRV, refers to the ongoing carbon and biodiversity monitoring that ensures that habitats in question are transitioning as predicted and that at least the estimated quantum of carbon being sold is actually being accrued in the habitat. So the data and MRV document details how monitoring plans are designed according to existing and emerging best practice in remotely sensed geospatial and primary fieldwork data collection methods, drawing upon conservative conservation expertise through a network of project partners who are best positioned to test and adapt and develop these methods. In the long term, Wilder Carbon anticipates a set of standard certified approaches to monitoring above and below ground carbon across a broad range of habitats, but obviously that is not something that's quickly and easily developed. Next slide, please, Sarah. So when integrating the best available carbon data into the Carbon Plus Habitat tool, we classify the data sources into 3 different confidence classifications of low, medium or high. So this influences the size of the buffer applied to the estimates of carbon uplift, which then feeds through to the EIUs before they're sold. So these minimum defensible estimates are a core principle of wilder carbon and ensure that the estimated quantum of carbon being sold is actually being accrued in the given habitat. So this table here shows which habitats are currently in which confidence classes, and the buffer ranges from 20% for high confidence data scenarios through to 40% for medium confidence data scenarios. Units aren't sold against low confidence data scenarios, but instead these projects are actually earmarked for research and development and provide valuable opportunities to develop methods, data sets and calculations that can then support modelling for future projects with those similar unusual habitats. And these sites do actually still have potential for post-verification sales. So wilder carbon are in the early stages of developing projects and methodologies, working with a wide range of partners to generate new valuable carbon data sets for understudied habitat types, such as seagrass, hedgerows, and a range of other terrestrial and marine habitats. So these can input directly into carbon modelling, into the Carbon Plus Habitat tool, and hopefully at that point as high confidence data sets. Similarly, primary data from the MRV stage, so the monitoring of sites over time, for carbon uplift can then recycle into the forecasting and carbon and biodiversity modelling as well. Okay.
It's me. Okay, so moving on to partner eligibility. So that could be that there's a number of partners within the standard that have requirements set out on the project development side, but also on, of course, the buyer and investment side. So we've updated the standard to include provisional trusted deliverers. So in version 1, we had eligibility requirements for trusted deliverers who had a track record in safeguarding nature in perpetuity and fundamentally were able to demonstrate how they could do that going forward. They had the resources and the structure and the setup to be able to deliver nature restoration with biodiversity goals. We recognise that there's loads of upcoming companies who have the structure and have the mission alignment and the resources to be able to deliver these projects, but not necessarily the track record. And so what we are allowing is provisional trusted deliverers who conditionally meet the requirements, apart from the fact that they don't have at least 5 years of it being incorporated. And so these outfits can become provisional trusted deliverers with the same arrangements to be able to use the tools and the templates and the project development kit to be able to develop and register projects. But they will also require for their projects to be secured under conservation covenant or other legal mechanism until such time conservation covenant is formally in place that will secure that management approach to the land in question. So we have added that conservation covenant itself. So the legislation for conservation covenant and designation for responsible bodies, this actually came into effect in August last year. And so it can legally be applied with using a preemption. So an intent to enter into it when you can legally enter into it, having received designation as a responsible body. So we can use the agreements, but we recognise that there is yet to be the portal by which an individual organisation can apply to become a responsible body. So we have to use that preemption vehicle for now. And investors as well. We had, of course, our ethicality requirements for buyers to provide evidence on how they are set to reduce their emissions and follow mitigation hierarchy before then considering the use of units like wilder carbon units. But we have now also introduced eligibility for investors, for those who want to invest across the portfolio of projects or support research and development. Another thing that we are exploring this year is a project developer trial. So we realise that there are lots of private landowners who will want to have help in developing their project and putting together a management plan that aligns to the standard, a monitoring approach that aligns to the standard, and everything they need to be able to leverage carbon or other finance. And so we are testing a project developer model by which they can be licensed on a commercial capacity to be able to use the tools to deliver that land management service. Again, if that sounds of interest, please do get in touch. Ross, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to run through some updates in terms of project eligibility. So in terms of project types, in terms of sort of changes from version 1 of the standard, main changes that ponds have been removed from being a unit producing habitat transition, just because the data around the carbon removals from that is deemed to be not really certain enough to produce estimated issuance units upfront in projects. Not to say ponds can't be a feature of a project, they just at this point in time don't produce units for upfront sale. And obviously we're continuing to review data around a range of different habitat types and transitions, like what Lawrence was outlining earlier. So, you know, as we continue to do that, hopefully more and more habitat transitions will become ones where units can be sold up front as data becomes more available on them. And projects continue to be underpinned by the minimum intervention approach and underpinned by the desire to kind of realise demonstrable benefits for both nature and climate. In terms of minimum intervention approach, we've created some guidance around assisted regeneration for projects. That's on the website now. So that gives some kind of intervention gateways, you know, detailing at what points interventions might take place within a project and some suggested approaches for those interventions as well. So that's quite a useful resource for projects to review. In terms of requirements around Carbon Plus, so there's a requirement for projects to demonstrate wider benefits around, you know, social and environmental benefits wherever possible, and wherever those aren't in conflict to the primary carbon and biodiversity objectives. So the standard has a section on this which outlines the sort of minimum requirements, and this will kind of continue to evolve as we go forward, along with many other aspects of the standard. In terms of project design, there's no significant changes in terms of the actual project design, but we're developing a project development portal at the moment, and we're hoping that will allow projects to submit documentation and information for registration and for the validation process through that portal, rather than doing it all through documents, which will improve version control and just make the process more efficient. We've also got a very kind of exciting project pipeline that's developing, and so sort of through developing that pipeline, that will continue to kind of improve the sort of project development process and how that all works. Then in terms of validation, linked to that, we continue to work with the Soil Association, who are our independent validation and verification partners, and so we're hoping that this new project development portal will make that process of validation easier, that the Soil Association can take all the information and documentation off of that portal. And we're also co-developing a wild carbon project development training course as well, to roll out to project developers, to kind of upskill them in terms of the wild carbon process and how it all works, so that project developers can increasingly develop their own projects and submit them through that portal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Evan.
So just to reiterate, I think some of the things which should have come out through what others have been saying. So biodiversity remains a core component of wild carbon. We only work in native habitats, restoration of native habitats. The carbon data that we use is the best available data used to generate minimum defensible estimates, which basically de-risk for deliverers, buyers, and everyone else. Also enables us to work across a greater range of habitats within a single system than the individual habitat codes have been able to do before, which gives us greater scalability going forwards in terms of investment and general impact. And then, of course, the final piece that's been mentioned and has been alluded to a little bit in the chat, and I think we'll probably come back to, is that we only sell to buyers, companies that are on their journey towards net zero, undertaking a demonstrable action to reduce their emissions. And in that way, we can actually claim that we're having a genuine positive impact on climate. If we go on to the next slide, and where this gets to, as Sarah was just mentioning, is we're looking to scale up substantially, building on the system we've created, building on the community of practice that now exists around existing and pipeline projects, continuing to improve our monitoring, reporting and verification systems, as Lawrence was going through. There will be other iterations for the standard. We've already got a kind of wish list of things that we want to include in the next version. We will continue to apply wilder carbon to new areas such as insetting, which we are exploring very seriously at the moment. In fact, we've got some pilots going with private sector companies who are looking to use credits generated, units generated from their own land towards their own targets on a non-tradable basis. So it's about constant improvement, constant learning, constant innovation, iteration, and thinking about ecosystem application, because ultimately that's where we're going to really be able to achieve substantial impact for nature and climate, and that's what the standard is about.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, so just a quick what next for wilder carbon, and then I'm going to open up because we've got loads of brilliant questions. So what's next? More of the same. So now we've proven the concept and we've got to the point of sale. We're going to be continuing to develop our pipeline of projects with trusted deliverers and with private landowners. We'll be expanding our buyer pool and seeking offtake agreements to help boost the pipeline and our research and development work. And we'll be scaling our impact through the project developer trial, as I mentioned. We're going to be really focusing on upskilling our trusted deliverer network, both in terms of developing projects, but also around selling their units to UK approved buyers. And so how can you be involved? So you could become a trusted deliverer or submit a project idea or speak to us about your own land holding and partnering with a trusted deliverer. You could become an approved buyer, or you could refer a business or your own company to explore how they could become an approved buyer. And you can express your interest in joining our technical standards board or the supporting advisory board so that we can continue to improve the standard and the operating mechanism. So do get in touch if any of that sounds of interest. And then I will quickly come out of the slides so that we can stop staring at PowerPoint and open for questions. And I will select people, hopefully, to answer the specific questions that we have. Now, do bear with me because we've got some questions in the chat and we've got some questions in the Q&A as well. So one question that came from Maria, and also so there's a follow-on question as well. So Maria has asked us the question, how the price of unit was determined and whether we're in a position to share the average price of units that have been sold to date, and what sort of habitats they were generated from. So Evan, if I could invite you to answer our exploration of unit pricing, what we're selling units at, and then Ross, if you could talk about the two projects that we've matched with approved buyers, please.
Yes, so really difficult actually to work out our price point initially. We did a lot of research. We ended up talking to a lot of companies who are shadow budgeting for high integrity carbon and were doing that for a product that really didn't exist prior to the creation of World of Carbon. Now we've gone to market, the price that we're selling at, which is £75 this year and will be £100 next year, is we know not one that is putting people off at all. We have done work with the potential buyers that we're talking to, and a very small percentage of them indeed are put off by price. Those companies that are serious about buying into this premium market and want to do things properly understand that it's a more costly and justifiably costly product.
Yeah, and then in terms of the habitat type, so the two live projects at the minute, first is one in Kent, owned by Kent Wildlife Trust, which is a former golf course, which is obviously grassland with scattered, lines of trees, etc., surrounded by areas of existing woodland. And so that project is about naturalistic sort of development of scrub and woodland, natural regeneration of that across the site, initially with some cattle grazing on the site, and the level of grazing will obviously be sort of amended as we go and as we see how that develops. So that's the first project in Kent. The second one is Honeygar, which is former dairy farm on Lowland Peak in the Somerset Levels. So, and that project is run by Somerset Wildlife Trust, who own the site as well. And that's obviously grassland on drained peat. So that project's all about re-wetting the site, turning it back into a more naturalistic sort of fen and wet grassland scenario on the peat soils. So that's a bit of a summary of the two projects. But you can go on the website and look at some further detail about the two projects. They've both got project profile pages with maps and documents, etc. that are on them.
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, Tash, if I could ask you to start sharing some links as well, that would be really useful if you could share the links to Honeygar and Heathercorey Vale. The next question is from Richard. Hi, Richard. Richard Clark has asked, will the units count towards net zero? Evan, if you could talk about the different nature of our units, EIUs versus verified, and what they count towards, please.
Yes, so I was just saying in the chat, so units are only available to UK headquartered companies. That is because we want them to genuinely be able to count towards net zero. You can be carbon neutral, of course, if you offset internationally. If you want to be net zero, you have to be dealing with your emissions in the country that they are emitted within. Once you buy estimated issuance units, you then have to wait for them to actually be verified so that they can be counted as having dealt with those emissions, at which point they are logged on the registry as having been used. And yes, those can then be used against net zero claims in line with the environmental reporting guidelines published by BEIS some time ago. So absolutely, we meet the quality criteria that were set up in those guidelines, and it is a legitimate way for a UK company to offset its residual emissions.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, so there's some more questions around asking for further detail around processes. So from Jack, he has asked about the detailed due diligence process for buyers. What I would do is link you to the specifics within the standard that set out the eligibility criteria, and what we will be publishing within the next couple of weeks is a more detailed paper, because people have been asking these questions about what we accept as appropriate evidence evidence to meet the eligibility criteria. And what we found is that everyone is on their own individual sustainability journey, and we need to apply proportionate judgments and proportionate effort in terms of the amount of evidence that a company would provide. So, for example, if you have an SME with low carbon intensity, low resources, you're not going to expect them to be taking the same sort of action or signing up to the same sort of initiatives as you would a huge blue chip organization with high carbon intensity and massive resources. So the evidence to meet the eligibility criteria really does need to be proportionate. So I will share and follow up with you, Jack, and anybody else who wants to see it. But it will again be published on the website for everyone to see how we will be approaching our due diligence assessments. The other question that I saw was around stacking. Let's dive back into stacking. Why not? So we have a question from, bear with me 2 seconds. Scrolling back up here. Sebastian, thank you for your question. Assuming these won't be able to be stacked with BNG or peatland woodland codes. Evan, would you like to take that one?
There's quite a lot in there.
Yeah.
So yes, theoretically, they should be able to be stacked with BNG if the project is set up in the right way. So that's as far as we are concerned. As far as the BNG guidelines that have come out are concerned, that goes to my point about there is a lack of nuance, as we see it, in terms of the way that they are viewing a site. So a biodiversity net gain deal is put together through the planning system. They work to redline boundaries. The worst case scenario on many of the sites that we're working on, and we are doing this at Heathercorrie Vale in Kent at the moment, we would basically create a sub area where that red line boundary is, and then put some of the rest of the same land holding into carbon unit generation. Or we could look at, as I say, the kind of 30-year plus time frame after BNG has been achieved, and further uplift that could be brought to bear from a biodiversity standpoint. And if that matched to the standard, that would also be legitimate in terms of a further 50% uplift. But that is why we are also working with DEFRA quite hard to say that we think that there is no need for that, providing there is no double counting around mitigating for the same thing from the square meter using the same ecosystem service. We do not think that that kind of restriction is useful, and we are hoping we can actually get some greater flexibility brought into play there. As far as the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code are concerned, we basically can work across all of the habitats that are workable through those two codes. It might be that, for instance, we do have a site we're looking at the moment in our pipeline. There are landowners who are already in a scheme with the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code. They have other areas on their land that aren't under those schemes because they're quite restrictive, and we are inherently more flexible because of the approach we take to the data. And in this particular land holding case, we may well end up with, again, a kind of separation geographically within the same land holding, whereby some of that land holding is being run by that landowner through Woodland Carbon Code, some through Peatland Code, and then the rest of it with us. So it's very context specific. It is not impossible. Thank
you, Evan. So next, Alex Hipkiss, hello. You've asked a few questions. One or two, I think, hopefully have already been answered or touched upon in relation to stacking, interaction with Peatland Code, Woodland Code, etc. So the one I will go with is you've asked about allowing brokers or aggregators So I think roles and responsibilities is quite a good one to touch upon. So of course we're starting out, and so what we're finding is that we're having to drive both the development and the implementation of the standard, along with the operational mechanism that needs to support that, to make it work in practice. So as I mentioned, we're supporting on keeping both pipelines going, both sides of the market, developing the projects and matching those to approved buyers. Wilder Carbon Limited is operating a not-for-profit, and that not-for-profit model is really important to us so that we can enable as much finance into climate impact and nature impact as possible on the ground. And so we would work with brokers and we would work with aggregators if it will scale the impact that we're trying to achieve in a way that doesn't kind of bust that not-for-profit aim and take too much money away from the action on the ground. I hope that answers your question. Next question from Caroline Turner. How will we make sure businesses are purchasing units ethically? Are we planning to do any ongoing monitoring of the businesses and their net zero ambitions? Evan, do you want to take this one?
Sorry, I'm just writing response to Sue's Polludiculture question as well, which I will just press send on before I come into that. Right, so which is basically, as I just said in there, you know, we're exploring various things, including agroforestry overlaps, regenerative agriculture overlaps, polludiculture would I think fit into there as well. Monitoring of companies, yes, is the short answer. We expect that companies who are approved buyers will publish annual reports which show how they're getting on with their emissions reduction journey. In really, you know, extreme scenarios where we think they have not been making enough effort and we're getting into the territory where they might be buying offsets rather than actually taking action, then we do actually have the ultimate right to take them off the approved buyer list. But we see this as a way of driving improved behaviour at the corporate level. So we want to engage with people to make sure that, you know, they can do the best possible job at reducing their emissions, as well as being part of Wilder Carbon. It's as any of you will know who work on the corporate side, it's a very, very active dialogue that's going on amongst the private sector at the moment as to what the best methods of putting together reduction strategies are. There are genuinely hard to abate industries that we think we should be working with, because and some of them, as you will again know, no doubt, are actually required for the transition to a low carbon economy. So it is a complicated area, and we will again continue to work on this through the Corporate Claims Advisory Board and continue to finesse our approach.
Thank you, Evan. There's been a few more questions around price. So from Sanchi, hello there, and also from Chris. Largely around there being, while there is a fixed price of £75 per unit, I did hear some units might have gone below this threshold. We've only sold at £75, and we'd hope that we would only see that price increase as our brand and model strengthens and we increase our kind of advocacy and credibility around the standard. And Chris, you mentioned that your comment was so unit price would be less than international, and that so your unit price will be much less than international units, so will BNG, etc., add to match international units. I think so £75 we believe to be the highest value that a nature-based voluntary carbon unit has attracted internationally. And separate from that, your question about BNG, So obviously it's coming in as a mandated thing in November, and we believe that BNG units are attracting somewhere between 20 and 30,000 a unit. But obviously there's a locality element. It's a very sort of separated and mandated thing, working specifically with developers. I hope that answers your question, but do feel free to. So yes, just carbon. We are just selling the carbon benefit. So that's the use of that carbon data within your company reporting, obviously once the unit has been verified, and we are currently selling them as estimated issuance units until they are verified. And we are selling those at £75 per unit. 1 unit equals 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. Okay. And then there was a question from another one from Maria. And actually it's leading on from that. So you mentioned potentially having a biodiversity unit. Are you going to develop your own methodology for this or work with some of the ones already out there? And what is your general thinking on the right approach to quantifying biodiversity? Evan, if you could answer that and also add on the kind of, yeah, the biodiversity market element, is there one or not?
Yes, I might start with that. So I think there's been some really interesting work done on biodiversity units recently. I think a lot of it is quite complex. And there is a question in my mind as to whether it necessarily needs to be as complex, but the biggest question in my mind is to whether there actually should be a tradable biodiversity unit at all. So obviously biodiversity, by its very definition, biological diversity is extremely diverse across geographies, and one of the basic principles of things like the BEHAVIOURAL scheme, the Business and Biodiversity Offsets scheme internationally, which ironically actually biodiversity net gain in the UK was based upon, is that you can't really offset impact on one specific region's biodiversity and another region's biodiversity. So that inherently limits tradability in a way that carbon units don't have, because carbon units are the same from one place to another. So I'm not sure it's ever going to be it shouldn't be in my mind ever be a kind of openly traded market situation with biodiversity units. I therefore see them more as a ESG or a task force for disclosure on nature type products for nature positive businesses, to have a quantified beneficial impact at a given site, maybe to be able to use that in their accounts. I think that's fine, and we are going to explore whether we work with others and adopt some of their mechanisms there, or whether we come up with our own version as it becomes clearer what extent of market there really is.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, so I'd like to have 3 more questions if I can, very quick round. There's so many good questions, and we will take all of these and develop them further into our Q&A, which we'll make publicly available on the website, because there's definite themes. And I think some of the ones that I'll come back to will demonstrate that. So first of all, I'd like to come back to a question asked by B Beggs. I hope I pronounced your name correctly there. Sorry to ask when I'm sure you've covered before, but I think, you know, it just demonstrates how complicated this is, just to get all of our heads straight. So if wilder carbon is explicitly not bundled, can BNG be sold on the same parcel as wilder carbon, or would these sales need to be on separate parcels? And so I think the key thing here is, whether it's bundled or stacked, is we want to make sure that we're not selling the same thing twice. but to two different people. So we're strongly considering the bundling approach. We're already speaking to people about testing what a bundled BNG and carbon unit looks like. And that could be from the same parcel, because in our terms and conditions, in our Wilder Carbon terms and conditions, it's set out very specifically what you are purchasing, the carbon benefit, the use of that carbon data in your corporate accounting. And so we feel that there's justification to be able to bundle those benefits together, to sell to a company who had that requirement of both those things at an agreed price that provided the appropriate value. Stacking, as Evan mentioned earlier, is more complicated, and that's why we really want to test the principles that we've put in place. And what we'll need to do is really explore the intent to stack with each project developer, and look at the model that they are proposing. And we've set out three options, which is about a spatial, which is separated by the land parcels, or temporal, if there's really distinct and differentiated outcomes and what that looks like over time, or a dynamic habitat model, which explores how you might just take a percentage of the value of BNG versus carbon over a particular site, which we think would be quite supportive of a minimum intervention approach to the management. So we really need to test these in practice, but we think the principles are suitably flexible to be able to explore that. And then the next question, I'm just looking at some of these have been answered already, so I'm quickly whizzing through. So Chris has come back on the unit price point, and I know that we've talked about it quite a bit, but your comment was quite interesting, Chris, about the fact you were quoted much lower unit price by others in the UK. So well done. Thank you. And I think this really goes to another thing that we want to do is drive up the price of carbon. And that might not be what buyers want to hear, but Evan, if you could just explain a little bit about our approach to the value.
Yeah, I mean, we disagree with cheap carbon, basically. that's our approach. You know, the price of carbon needs to enable genuine 50-year minimum permanence, and £2 a tonne internationally, I would argue, probably doesn't, even in the international context, and £22 a tonne in the UK, we know doesn't work for a lot of landowners. And if you've got high quality organisations involved with a track record of actually assuring that land holdings are well managed and to delivering biodiversity and carbon benefits simultaneously, as the conservation sector in the UK does all the time, it's just we've never valued it for that, then I think that should be priced in a fair way. And I also think that landowners coming into the market should also get a fair price. So we have always pitched this as a premium product, and it will remain so, and the price will go up over time as demand increases, because we also don't want to facilitate any companies sort of not taking action to reduce their emissions over buying offsets.
Thank you, Evan. Okay. So just a very, very quick congratulations to Gary Mantle and co. I've just seen your comment there about the Bristol Avon catchment market about to open expressions of interest. So well done to that, and thank you for sharing the link. That's excellent. And then finally, I've had quite a lot of people asking about the project developer pilot. So this is basically about deploying the standard at scale. We can't support every trusted deliverer and every private landowner who wants to develop a project. All of you will probably know it takes tremendous sort of time, skills and capacity to be able to do it at scale. And we really want to achieve impact now with the tools that we have developed. So we want to look at how experts in the field. So this could be anyone who meets the eligibility as a trusted deliverer, but also anybody who meets the eligibility as a responsible body. And that's basically having mission alignment, environmental goals, and ambition for biodiversity improvements, and of course all of the expertise to be able to design and develop a wilding, a minimum intervention management plan and approach for a landowner. And if you can give that advice, you'll be able to use the Wilder Carbon tools. So that's the Carbon Plus Habitat tool that provides the estimations around your carbon and biodiversity uplift, as well as the project development toolkit to develop a Wilder Carbon project. And you can charge for that expertise and those services. So we're exploring a licensing model to enable you with those tools. So if that sounds of interest, again, it is a pilot. We will be developing the training modules and finalizing the commercial model that sits around that in practice. But if that sounds of interest, then please do get in touch and we can provide further information. So looking at the time, we've got 2 minutes left. Thank you everyone so much for your questions. I'm sorry that I didn't get around to answering all of them, but we will follow up with you afterwards if there's anything that we've clearly missed. Please do get in touch with the team if you want to talk about anything further. Thank you very much for your valuable time and for listening and for your support. And we hope to be in touch with you all very soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.